I had a roommate from El Salvador back when I was in grad school. People would ask him what he is, and he'd say, I'm an American. And they say, yeah, but you're not from the US. He'd be like, I know, but I'm an American. And so historically speaking, most people, most everybody throughout history encountered, most strangers looked like they looked. And of course, you know that this Linnaeus guy was European because you can see what he said about Europeans. He thought that of all the white people in the world, these were the best representation of whiteness. You know, a lot of black people see colored as a racist term. And like colored never became identified as a racist term. It's just that people don't know what to say about the term other than, yeah, it's just kind of not used anymore. Kind of like Caucasoid. Almost every single white European group that came to the United States was seen in negative terms, in negative ways, by other European groups. It's especially true of Southern Europeans and especially true of Catholics. Everybody who lives in the countries that you see on that map is actually an American. In the United States, we've come to think about Americans as U.S. citizens. Like we reserve Americans for that, or we use Americans for that, and many people around the world do as well. But in Latin America, historically, and still, many people talk about Americanos as anybody who's in the Western Hemisphere is technically an Americano. So that means, you know, North, Central, and South American, and the Caribbean. In Spanish, we have this adjective, we have this term, estadounidense, which means United Statesian. And it's a term that you use when you're in Spanish for someone from the United States. But like, we don't have that in the U.S. And if we had that in the U.S., we would use it as a United Statesian, but we don't. But it does exist. And I think it has value to kind of step outside of things. You know, I had a roommate from El Salvador back when I was in grad school, and he would always just say, like, people would ask him what he is, and he'd say, I'm an American. And they say, yeah, but you're not from the US. He'd be like, I know, but I'm an American. Soy Americano. And people just really didn't comprehend that this is a term that has just come to be used by many people to reference people in the United States, but it hasn't always been that way. And it's not that way for everybody. With science, what we want to do is we want to categorize the world. And we want to break it up into these tiny parts and explain causality. You know, most people in a given geographic region look very similar to one another. And so unless somebody migrates in from outside that region and with very different physical features, they're largely going to look like everybody else. And so historically speaking, most people, most everybody throughout history encountered, most strangers looked like they looked. Because, you know, you're walking around and you're only going to get so far as to see other people who look like you look. But when people got on boats and they started traveling to distant shores, you get off the boat and suddenly you see these people that look very, very different from you. And what that did for those who are more science-minded was spark them to try to categorize human groups in terms of their physical characteristics. And we later come to talk about that as races, right? So racial categorizations. And this Linnaeus was one of the first people to do that. And you see, like, he came up with 3 different groups. And of course, you know that this Linnaeus guy was European because you can see what he said about Europeans, right? People who were like him. Of course, you never are going to categorize people and make the proclamation that your people are the lowest form or whatever it is that's negative. You're going to elevate your own group and push down the qualities and characteristics of others. So there were really, he kind of put dark and red together. And then, of course, you know, look what he says about people of African ancestry, right? Lazy, negligent, crafty. Anoints himself with grease. I'm not really sure what that how that fits. But this is, in the early to mid 18th century that we were starting to develop what would be seen as these kind of racist categories, meaning that certain groups of people are better than, for whatever reason, are better than other groups of people. Smarter, stronger, more efficient, more crafty, just overall, in some characteristics, right? Well, other people moved on from this. So go to the next one. And so this guy, Blumenbach, came up with 5 categories of people. And this is, I think he did this in 1775 is when he published this. But note that white people were the Caucasoid people. So later come to be called Caucasians. And that term Caucasian, and I just always found this really interesting. His idea, these were people from the Caucasus region, which is this kind of strip of land between the Caucasus Mountains, between Russia and Georgia. And his idea, as I recall, if I recall correctly, was that he thought that of all the white people in the world, these were the best representation of whiteness because they were, he thought, the purest form and the most beautiful. And so he decided, hey, we're going to name, this is like the most elevated groups, and so we're going to name Caucasians after the people of this particular region. And that's where that word comes from, right? Which is kind of interesting because nobody uses that today, really, except white people never use that. I almost never hear white people using that. And mostly brown people don't use it, but I do hear black people and black Americans often, and I hear some white people, I guess I do, but I hear, but not many people. Most white people don't. It's just like Caucasians, right? It's not a term that really is in fashion anymore. But it's kind of interesting to kind of think about where these things are and how we've evolved, right? And it's kind of funny. If I have this idea that if white people were minoritized and empowered as some kind of minority group, which many white people think that we are a minority group at this point, but if white people were more minoritized and empowered, I think white people would see this as a racist term. People would have shifted in the way, in the similar way that a lot of black people see colored as a racist term, and colored never became identified as a racist term, but over the course of the past 15 or 20 years, it just really very much fell, probably 20 to 25, fell out of usage, right? You can say people of color, but you can't say colored people. And many people really identify that as racist, but it's never been racist. It's just that people don't know what to say about the term other than, it's just kind of not used anymore. Kind of like Caucasoid, right? Caucasian. It's very similar, right? It's just say white. So instead of saying colored, you say black. But what's also really interesting is that for a lot of people that don't speak English, colored and people of color, really, it's the same word. Colored people, people of color. But if you say color, if I say colored people would be, especially black people, but would be really upset. What are you using colored people for? But I hear people for whom English is not their first language often use this term. And it makes sense because people of color is really bulky. It makes no sense to say that. But colored people makes sense. That's how you learn English. Speaking English, you would say that. So anyway, I always find that really fascinating, these kinds of things. All right, man. The other thing about white people is that white people only relatively recently became white. Almost every single group, white European group, that came to the United States was seen in negative terms, in negative ways, by other European groups or people that came from Europe before them. It's especially true of Southern Europeans and especially true of Catholics. This is important because if you don't really understand your immigration history, then you can't really understand the relationships between people. That for most of the history of the United States, white Europeans were not in any way some unified category of people. So this is a cartoon from around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. These are mostly depicting Italians, and Italians were being depicted as rats who are coming over to infest the United States. And so you see all of these cartoons aimed at the undesirables coming from Europe, the people here in the United States, the leaders and the people already here, didn't want to come. So this idea now that we're kind of slamming the door on immigrants coming to the United States. There are a lot of people who don't want other people to come for various parts of the world and for various reasons. That's always been happening in the United States. So it's like you accept immigration when it's beneficial to you, but even then, very often, it's very grudgingly. So Italians, seen in deeply negative terms. And next slide. Here's another cartoon showing the Irish. Irish were always depicted as apes, and showing the Irish in these negative terms. And so, people, look at that. It's quite amazing, right? And so, Italian, Irish, all these groups in a negative way. So we're going to talk about being an American, and we're going to talk about being white. But in order to have the conversation, it really is important that we put some context behind this, that these are conversations that are constantly evolving and moving and going in different directions, and they will continue to do that.